Alice Knapp, president of the Ferguson Library, and I am delighted that we have author David Nicholls here tonight. What's exciting about doing these programs during COVID time is that we get to have authors from across the Atlantic who would normally not be here. So this is a very exciting evening. I also just want to mention that the library has been providing a lot of service during this COVID time. Everything from story time to crafternoons to how to do Excel spreadsheets. And we're delighted to do these. You should check out our YouTube channel because most of our programs are now recorded and available on YouTube. But I gotta tell you, all of this would not be possible without the Friends of the Ferguson Library. They are a wonderful cohort of volunteers who make this all possible. And I want to introduce Denise Marcel, who is on the board of the Friends of the Ferguson Library. And you're on mute.
Second take. Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the Friends of the Ferguson Library author series. Tonight we have David Nicholls from London, and before we start with him, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the Friends of the Ferguson Library, which we're a nonprofit organization of all volunteers, and our mission is to promote community support for the priorities and the programs and the activities of the Ferguson Library. And this author series is just one of the many programs that we bring to the community, and that's you. And you might want to make a note that on January 14th at 6 o'clock, we will have Amy Malloy, New York Times bestselling author, speaking about her new book, Good Night, Beautiful. And on February 16th, we are going to have Alka Joshi, the author of The Henna Artist, and that's one of my most favorite recent books. But that's only, the author series is only one thing we do. Another program that we do annually is our literary competition. And we receive hundreds of entries from Stanford students from elementary to high school. And another program people just love is our pub crawl, which visits neighborhood restaurants and for an evening of food and drink and some literary themed entertainment. And last year, we were fortunate. We had our first mini golf event at the Harry Bennett Library, and 500 golfers joined us for the weekend from ages 3 on up. And they putted their way around the Harry Bennett through the stacks, and everybody had a grand time. And we raised $11,000. But those fundraising events, of course, didn't happen this year. And if we're lucky, maybe later in next year they will. So if some of you tonight are longtime Friends members or have been a guest at some of our author series that we've had, you know, we usually hold them in person. And we have a reception when we serve wine and hors d'oeuvres for very modest $15. And the author series is a fundraiser as well, because it's an opportunity. What we like about it, it's an opportunity to introduce the library to a new generation of users. So we're moving but of course, like everything else, if we're possible, we've moved our series to Zoom. And when you register tonight, maybe you made a donation. And certainly if not, perhaps we would be so grateful if you could make a modest donation on the library's website, because what your donations do, they fund library programs such as our summer reading program, book discussions, the film programs we do, many cultural events. And the Friends actually provide scholarships and funding for the library staff's development as they take courses to improve what they do for the library. So now on to our special guest. Tonight, while we can't serve you wine, one benefit we do have from, and a silver lining of these virtual events, is that we can bring you authors who may likely never have been able to visit us before, such as tonight, live from London, is David Nicholls. He is the author of the international best-selling novels One Day and Us, and all his novels have sold over 8 million copies. The latter, Us, was longlisted for the very prestigious Booker Prize. He's also won a BAFTA for his television adaptation of Patrick Melrose, which starred Benedict Cumberbatch. And the BAFTA is the British equivalent of an Oscar or an Emmy. So that is a big deal. So tonight we're going to hear from David about his latest novel, Sweet Sorrow. And if you have not read it, I bet by the end of the evening, you will be rushing to order it from Elm Street Books, or which is our bookstore partner, or your favorite bookseller. Or of course, you can check it out from the library in print or audio or digital. So David, thank you for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
We are so delighted to have you. And I thought I'd just set the stage for David, for telling you, the audience, about what you write. David writes romantic comedies, but with a very unique touch. His novels are certainly romantic, but they're always have poignant elements and emotion. So there's certainly humor, but there's sadness. And his prose is exquisite. So let's talk about Sweet Sorrow. It's set in 1997, and it's about first love and relationships, other relationships with father-son. So would you tell us a little bit about the story and the characters?
Sure. Yeah. Sweet Sorrow. My last novel, Us, was about marriage and love in later life and long relationships. And I didn't want to write about that again. And I'd sort of been getting older with all of my novels. The characters were getting older. And I thought I'd go back to the very beginning, to the very unique experience, thrilling experience of first love, and try and summon up that sensation and how exciting it can be, and how troubled and painful and awkward and funny and important it can seem. So Sweet Sorrow is a classic first love summer story. It's about a boy called Charlie who's left school in 1997 and he's failed all his exams. He's not going to college. He doesn't know what he's going to do with his life. His family have broken up. His parents are splitting up. The atmosphere at home is terrible. And he has this long summer stretching ahead. And as he hopes, something happens. He meets a girl. He meets a girl called Fran and wants to see her, and then discovers to his horror that she's playing the lead role of Juliet in an amateur production of Romeo and Juliet. And the only way he's going to spend any time with her at all is to join the production. And for Charlie, the idea of being in a play, the idea of performing, the idea of speaking Shakespeare is horrific. But it's the price he has to pay to see Fran. And so the novel follows the course of their relationship, set against the background of this very earnest amateur production of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet.
So would you say that Sweet Sorrow it's accurate to call it a romantic comedy?
Yeah, I mean, well, all my novels have drawn on that tradition, but I've never quite been able to pull off a very, the classic happy ending. I mean, my favorite Shakespeare is Much Ado About Nothing, which in many ways is the model romantic comedy, Pride and Prejudice and the plays of Noel Coward and When Harry Met Sally, and they all have their roots in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, this idea of a mismatched couple who overcome their initial dislike and end up together. Well, there's lots of that in One Day and in Us and in Sweet Sorrow, but I've never, traditionally a Shakespearean romantic comedy ends with a wedding, ends with a marriage, ends with a union. And that's not something I've ever been able to pull off. So I definitely draw on that tradition, but more and more as I've got older, I've started to write about family as well, and family relationships and parent-children relationships. I'm of an age now where I can't really write convincingly about dating because I don't date. So I'm having to find different subject matter, and I'm more and more drawn to the business of family. So that plays a larger part perhaps than it does in most romantic comedies.
And very much in this book with Charlie and his father, and he's alone with his father during this summer.
Yeah.
Um, we can. Well, you would like to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to to write about youth, but to write honestly about youth, and not just write about the kind of the wildness, the wild nights and their camaraderie and the. I wanted to also to write about how frightening it can be and how lonely it can seem. And for Charlie, the primary anxiety in his life is the very difficult relationship he has with his father. His parents have broken up, and he's been left sort of as a carer, really, to look after his father, who has a condition that no one dares call depression. I was interested in the way that quite often there's a taboo around depression. The novel is set in 1997, and so maybe things are a little different now. But his father is drinking too much, has recently been declared bankrupt, doesn't really see a future. And yet for Charlie, this summer should be about seizing life and meeting friends and having wild times and staying up all night. And yet he's forced to be a carer, and at times resents that. So I wanted to write honestly about how awkward family relationships can become during adolescence. You know, adolescence is a time, at the beginning of this novel, Charlie doesn't quite know who he is. He thinks of himself as plasticine, as something that can change and be formed. And he's not quite sure who this adult person is. And often at that time of lives, we define ourselves in opposition to our parents. You know, we want to move away from them, transform ourselves into what they are not. And so it can be a very difficult time for both parents and for their offspring. And I wanted to write honestly about that the difficulties of that time in our lives.
One of the, I was thinking as I was reading the novel that, and the description of adolescent teenage love, that perhaps some of the viewers would wonder, oh, do I really want to read a book about teenage love? But I've read about you, and I see this in your writing, that you have a gift for making the reader feel young. You have a way of making you connect the generations, not only in the book, but I know for me, reading about teenagers that love. Can you talk about that? I mean, it's very effective.
Thank you. I mean, I was very keen not to write in the voice of a 16, 17-year-old. You know, it is very much an adult book. And with that in mind, it's a memory book. You know, it's someone looking back at that time. So it's written in the first person. You are with Charlie, but it's Charlie at a particular point of his adult life, remembering what he was like as a teenager. So he has, I think you're right, often a teenage voice, listening to a teenage voice throughout a novel for an adult, it can be wonderfully entertaining. You know, Catcher in the Rye is a wonderful book. But in this book, I wanted to do something different and write about memory, write about what happens when we look back at the foolishness of our youth, at the mistakes we made, at the misapprehensions we had about life, about the wrong turnings we took, but very much from the point of view of an adult. So the narrator, Charlie, is in his late 30s, is about to marry, and you don't know who. You find out during the course of the novel, and yet this summer is haunting him. I wanted to write about nostalgia as well. You know, in the last 3 books, there's often been a kind of 20-year gap. I'm very interested in how we change over periods of time and how we stay the same, how certain essential characteristics are part of us and how other things are more mutable. And with Charlie, he's sort of looking back at his youth with a kind of fond embarrassment. He has the kind of wisdom of an adult, but remembers vividly the thrills and the highs and the lows of being young. And I think that's what I want from the reader as well. I want the reader, even if they weren't 16 in 1997, I wasn't 16 in 1997, I'm a lot older than Charlie, but I still want the reader of whatever age to read the book and go, I remember that is what it felt like.
And that's why I think how you do it, that you tap in, you make the reader feel young. That was my experience. And well, let's talk about memory and nostalgia. Memories are selective, and different people, individuals having the same experience can remember something differently. I find that with my siblings all the time, that we remember some family event and I remember it very differently from, say, one of my brothers. And actually, I remember reading years ago, reading Memories of a Catholic Girlhood, Mary McCarthy. And it was an edition that had been published much later than the original edition. And she had notes at the end of various chapters. And one of the chapters, it said, the note was, my brother remembered this experience completely differently than me. He remembered blah, blah, blah. So because memory is so important in this, and nostalgia, is Charlie's memory, how does nostalgia color his memory, and how does it shape his memory?
Yes, I was interested. I read many years ago a book which I reread recently, which I absolutely loved, and this to me is the distillation of it. It's from one of my favorite writers, William Maxwell, from the great book So Long, See You Tomorrow. This, I think, sort of deals with this subject far more eloquently than I could ever express it. William Maxwell says, what we, or at any rate what I, refer to confidently as memory, meaning a moment, a scene, a fact that has been subject to a fixative and thereby rescued from oblivion, is really a form of storytelling that goes on continuously in the mind and often changes with the telling. Too many conflicting emotional interests are involved for life ever to be wholly acceptable, and possibly it is the work of the storyteller to rearrange things so that they conform to this end. In any case, in talking about the past, we lie with every breath we draw. I love the idea of memory as a kind of storytelling. And for Charlie, you know, it's not an objective truth. There's something about the summer which has haunted him, but there are things that he needs to get to the bottom of. And it's through the act of storytelling, through the act of telling the novel to the reader, that he comes to terms with certain events in the past and gains an understanding. So weirdly, the process of telling us the story as a narrator is a kind of therapy, I suppose, for Charlie. It doesn't cure everything, but it leads to a kind of understanding both for him and for the reader. And that's why I wanted to write it as a memory book. One other last thing, I don't want to get too boring on the subject, but the word nostalgia, I think, is often misunderstood. Often we think of it as a kind of, oh, wasn't it great? Wasn't the past wonderful? The root of the word, algia, means pain, and nos means home. It's the pain of home. And for me, it's a double-edged word, you know, that for Charlie in the novel, the past has become a bit of a hook. It's become something that is constantly holding him back and preventing him from going on to the next stage of his life. And he needs to tell this story to shed some of the pain and attachment of past. So I wanted it to be nostalgic, not in a rosy or naive way or a purely positive way, but to kind of grapple with the way that sometimes the past can haunt us and hold us back in the present.
It's very effective. Could you, I'm curious about how your switch, you had been an actor, how you made the switch from acting to writing.
Yeah, I was an actor, professional actor for about 8 years. I trained in I went to study drama at Bristol University, and then I trained in New York. I lived in New York for 18 months and studied at AMDA, the American Musical and Dramatic Academy, which was a terrible mistake, you know, because I can't sing, I can't do an American accent, I can't dance, I can't do any of the things that were required of me. But for me, acting was a way of staying involved with performance and storytelling and character. It seemed to me more accessible than writing. I didn't really know how I could ever be a writer, who I would write for, who would read my work, how I'd ever break into that world. I'd never met a writer. I didn't know how you became a writer. The only thing I ever wrote were letters. It seemed almost arrogant to write stuff and show it to people. I didn't have the confidence really to do it until much later in my 20s. So my way into storytelling and creating characters was through acting. And I had a very I worked maybe half the time. I was at the National Theatre in London for a long time. I worked with amazing actors like Judi Dench and Bill Nighy, and I was in Chekhov and Shakespeare and all these wonderful productions. I hardly ever spoke. I just used to stand with a spear or a broom or a sword and just populate the back of the stage. And that was my acting career. But I spent 8 years watching amazing actors speak extraordinary words. And it was a kind of training in a roundabout way. I was in the first production of Tom Stoppard's Arcadia. I didn't go on stage, but I understudied and I saw this play come to life, and it was an amazing experience. And I gradually realized that all the time I was acting, what I really wanted to do was write. That was by far the best job in the room. And so uh, even though I could have kept going, I'm very glad that I wasn't more successful. I would have only needed one or two small breaks to do it full time. And thankfully, that never happened. If I'd been more successful, I definitely wouldn't be a writer today.
And you have adapted now all or a number of your books into screenplays, and not many authors get to do that. Can you talk about that? And what's the difference of writing books and writing screenplays, and your experience in doing that?
Well, the sad truth is that adaptation is largely a form of butchery. I mean, really, you're hacking away. You're deconstructing something and throwing 60, 70, 80% of it away. That's the horrible truth. And if I hadn't been a screenwriter before I was a novelist, I'd find it much, much harder. But because I came to fiction after having written many scripts for television, I wrote episodic television for the BBC and for ITV for many years before I started to publish fiction. So I had a sense of the difference between the two tasks. When I started writing fiction, my editor said to me, it's okay to tell the reader what the character is thinking. It's okay to tell the reader what the character is feeling, because a screenplay is an instruction manual. It's not a work of literature in itself. It's a document which you give to 50 people, 60 people, 70 people, and you say, here are some instructions, make this. And the only thing you can give them are action and dialogue. You can show characters doing things and saying things, but if you're spending too much time writing notes saying, what he really feels is, or what you would like to say is, then you're not doing it right. You have to bury that stuff. You have to find all kinds of tricks to convey characters' inner lives through dialogue and action. When you write a novel, it's easy. You just put it on the page. That's fine. That's what fiction is. It is someone telling a story. I could talk about this for the rest of the session, but here's an example. In a screenplay, when you see two characters talking, a man and a woman, there's no way of knowing what their relationship is, but the presumption would be that they're having some kind of romantic relationship or friendship. How do you tell the viewer that they're brother and sister and not lovers? Well, it's very, when I speak to my sister, I never use the word sister. She never uses the word brother. But that's why when you watch so many dramas, people are saying, hi sis, hi brother, how are you doing? It's to let the audience know. In a novel, you don't even have to think about it. He went to see his sister. That's all you have to write. There's words on a page. You don't have to provide any dialogue. You don't have to give any clues. You just present the information. And it took me a long time to realize that those tools were open to me as a novelist. And once you know, it's extraordinary freedom. You don't have to worry about running times. You don't have to worry about budget. You don't have to worry about casting. You don't have to worry about any of those things that are hugely problematic for screenwriters. So I love both of them. I hope that I can always do both, but fiction is where you have the real power, and fiction you have a much more direct relationship between, a much more direct opportunity to say what you want to say, because it's just you.
Right, and you are speaking directly to an individual.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
You have that intimate relationship with the reader.
Yeah, but though you can't decide how a book's going to be read. You know, some people take 3 months to read a book. Some people read it in a single sitting. Some people read it very intently. Some people talk while they're reading. You know, when you are editing a film, what you're trying to recreate is a universal experience for everyone watching that story on screen in real time. So you want them to laugh at the same time. You want them to jump out of their seat at the same time. And there are all kinds of tricks and techniques with music and performance and editing to achieve that. With fiction, you've no idea where people are reading your book or how they're enjoying it or whether the radio's on or whether they're picking up on all your subtext. You know, there's no way. And so the collaborative, creative process of filmmaking is entirely different. And I really, really love both. But fiction is more direct. Fiction, I'm much more emotionally engaged in a piece of prose than I am in the screenplay, which is often quite a technical process. It's like architecture. You know, it's moving things around. It's creating a structure. It's not speaking from the heart, which fiction is for me. Particularly with this book. I mean, this is the most heartfelt book I've ever written, really.
And I was wondering if any of it is autobiographical, mostly because of the way you were able to evoke the emotions of teenager Charlie and his guy friends and Frank. You certainly you were tapping into were you tapping into familiar experiences?
I'm pretty diligent about writing away from my own experience. You know, with Charlie, he's the opposite of me in lots of ways. I was a very good student. You know, Charlie and I went to similar schools, pretty tough schools, but I was the kind of kid that Charlie would steal dinner money off. You know, I was a kind of Charlie would have bullied me. I was always, I loved the idea of being in plays. I loved Shakespeare from a very early age. I was the kind of kid he'd hate. And my family background was different. There's some overlaps between Charlie's dad and my dad, but they're broadly pretty different. So yeah, I tend to write away from myself, and at the same time, you can't write things that you haven't thought or felt. You know, how can you not draw on your own experience? So there's a kind of fundamental, I don't know, anxiety, awkwardness, self-consciousness that Charlie and I share, but also which I hope the reader shares as well. You know, I do want a sense of recognition. Yes, that's what it feels like to be 16 and to worry about being weird or lonely, or worry about the future, or worry about one's parents, worry that you're going wrong. You know, it can be a very fraught time, and those experiences I hope are universal. But there was no real life Fran. Charlie hates the idea of being in the play initially. I was always doing plays when I was his age. So there are many, many differences, and at the same time, hopefully, a fundamental truth. I think that's what you want from a novel. You know, you want it all to be made up and all to be true at the same time.
Well said. So would you read a little bit of
Sure.
Sweet Sorrow to us?
Yeah, when I was writing this book, initially it was a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that they were putting on. And I thought, well, it's a novel about first love. So why not write about the great play about first love, Romeo and Juliet, and maybe have fun with the differences between the classical Shakespearean heroic version and the kind of more squalid, messy, awkward, real life version. And so it's not a spoiler to say that Charlie and Fran get together. So this is a passage from later in the novel, and it's called Love. Love is boring. Love is familiar and commonplace for anyone not taking part. And first love is just a gangling, glandular incarnation of the same. Shakespeare must have known this. Take a copy of the world's most famous love story and pinch between finger and thumb the pages where the lovers are truly happy. Not the build-up that precedes it, not the strife that follows, but the time when love is mutual and untroubled. It's a few pages, a pamphlet almost, the brief interlude between anticipation and despair. The confidences and intimacies of new lovers, the formation of private jokes, the confessions of doubt and insecurity, the reassurances and vows. There's only so much of that stuff that anyone can bear. And if Shakespeare ever did write the scenes where the lovers talk about their favorite food, or pick the fluff from their belly buttons, or earnestly explain the lyrics of their favorite songs, then he was right to exclude them from the second draft. The beginning and the end, the anticipation and the despair, that's where the story lies, but the state of being in love, and in particular of being young and in love, is like listening to someone describe their parachute jump or their bizarre dream. It's the blurred photograph of a life-changing performance taken from too far away. The more intense the experience, the less inclined we are to hear about it. And while we're happy that their life was changed, and it must have been thrilling, can we move on? So, best to assume that when we were alone and we weren't talking, but then we were kissing or fooling around, and that this was all amazing, so much so that I couldn't comprehend why grown-ups weren't doing it all the time, something I suppose that we will spend the rest of our lives discovering. Assume that when we stopped long enough to talk, those conversations were all more open and insightful, free-flowing and intense, funny and serious and profound than any other conversation that has ever taken place. Not just talking, but really talking. Assume that we were funnier than anyone we'd ever met, and that the time when I made Fran laugh so much that she wet herself was one of the proudest moments of my life. Assume that nothing was felt in a half-hearted way, whether passion or anxiety, desire or fear. Assume that we made compilations and liked each other's music fiercely, and if not, pretended to. That we listened solemnly and silently to Nick Cave and Scott Walker singing about us, Nico and Nina Simone auditioning for the song that would be our song, the song that made us cry, and that other behavior previously thought to be silly or repulsive, holding hands, aggressive public kissing, the passing of chewing gum from mouth to mouth, lost its queasiness. Assume that we never wanted to be anywhere else or with anyone else, that time apart was time wasted, and that it was impossible to imagine the circumstances where we might not feel this way. There's some of this to come, not much more than a pamphlet, and it can't be helped. The greater part of it will go unmentioned, but also unforgotten. I'll stop there.
Marvelous. Marvelous. Well, it looks like we have a number of questions.
Great.
And Barb Thomas, I hope you'll join us. And
Yes.
I'm not seeing any questions. I'm not seeing any questions come up in the chat just yet. If you have a question, please type it in the chat. I have a question for you, David. How do you feel about being called the man who made a nation cry? I can remember reading that probably not long after I listened to One Day, and I can tell you I remember exactly where I was on the BQE under the promenade when I was driving, when when there was that incredible moment of real sorrow. So is that something that propels your writing to write to something that's a surprise?
One Day was sort of conceived as what they used to call a weepy. I wanted it to be very, very, very funny, and then very, very, very sad, and then perhaps funny again and sad again, and for it to be a combination of the two. That seemed to me the most honest expression of what it's like to grow up, to get older, that it's that there are highs and lows, and that's what I wanted to write. And that sort of happened with us in Sweet Sorrow as well. The most common response, I suppose, to those three books in particular is that they make people laugh and cry. And I'm very happy for both responses, for people to laugh out loud and to find it emotional. I think the danger, if there is a danger, it's that it can become an obligation, and that therefore you end up writing mawkish, sentimental, predictable melodrama, that you feel that you can't write a novel which is just funny or a novel which is just serious. And I would never want to do that. I'd hate people to put down a book I'd written and say, well, I didn't burst into tears, it's a disaster. I don't want to feel obliged. But I'm delighted when people have a big emotional response to things. And I think with us and Sweet Sorrow, perhaps it's a little more subtle. It's not a big melodramatic flourish. It's more an atmosphere, and I'm just very aware of sentimentality. I do want people to identify and have an emotional response, but I don't want to be yeah, melodramatic or manipulative. We just in the UK we've done a TV version of Us, which I think is coming to PBS in the USA next year, and you know that had a really big emotional response from the audience, especially the last 2 episodes. If you've read the novel, you know that it starts as a kind of comedy of divorce and turns into something more emotional. And I was really pleased with the response. I mean, it's thrilling for a writer to have your program on and know that maybe 1 million people are emotionally engaged at the same time at 9:45
Right.
on a Sunday night. That's exciting. At the same time, yes, just to repeat myself, I don't want to ever feel an obligation to produce the same effect with each book.
Right. We do have a couple of questions coming in now. What are you interested in writing about next?
Oh, I wish I knew. You know, I was going to write a little novella this year. I was going to write a little love story set in contemporary London because I'd written so much about the past and people getting older. I thought just write about the here and now and focus in on the present day. And then the present day exploded and, it became impossible to write about the present day because any novel set in 2020 immediately becomes dated in 2021. So I'm having a little break, not partly deliberate because I have family and they're around much more and it's harder to write, but also just to let the dust settle. Really, I think there's a lot to be written about what we're going through at the moment, not just the pandemic but other things as well. But often you need to let the dust settle and look back a little bit. So I'm not working on any new fiction at the moment. I just finished the first draft of a screenplay of Sweet Sorrow, which I really love. It's a kind of 400 Blows, Gregory's Girl, coming of age story, love and pain and grief, all the awkwardness of being 16 and 17, and I'm really pleased with that screenplay. But I don't know what's next. I don't know. I suspect that it'll be more about family because I'm not sure if, I think romantic love is fascinating and will always be a part of what I'm writing. But one tends to write about one's preoccupations, and I'm much more preoccupied with the business of family and parenthood now than I was when I started writing fiction.
Well, we'll look forward to that. So can you talk a little bit about the use of music in your novels?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that for me they're tied together. I wanted One Day to be like a pop song. I wanted it to be a big, bittersweet, grand, overproduced, epic pop song that had popular appeal. The one I had in my head was something like God Only Knows by the Beach Boys, or I Say a Little Prayer by Aretha Franklin, something that was really uplifting and also emotional. And I was trying to write the fictional equivalent of that feeling, being caught between laughter and tears. That's what that book was. But also music is a wonderful prod for the memory. When I was writing One Day and I wanted to remember what 1989 and 93 and 97 and 2003 felt like, I found myself turning to music as much as I turned to newspaper headlines. So for me, music is also a little key into the past. I no longer listen to music while I write because I don't have the concentration for that anymore, though I have in the past. There's a scene in One Day where Dexter has a terrible time at a nightclub, and that was written very, very quickly to pounding dance music, freehand actually, in one go, because that I wanted to get that energy onto the page. My last novel, doesn't really have any music in it at all because Douglas, the voice of the novel, doesn't really get music. He likes classical music, he likes music that's soothing, but he's not a fan. He couldn't name a piece of music. And so even though there are pieces of music for me that summon up the mood of the prose, the character didn't have a playlist. Sweet Sorrow, though, certainly there were some songs from the 90s. There's a great song by Pulp called David's Last Summer, which was as much an influence for me for this book as many other novels. When I was writing this book, I have a kind of literary playlist, and for this novel, it was books like Goodbye Columbus by Philip Roth, or The Graduate, or For Esme with Love and Squalor, or Franny and Zooey. That's why the protagonist, the heroine of this novel is called Fran. It's because Salinger is so good on youth. So Franny and Zooey was very much in my mind. And I have a similar musical set of inspiration as well for each book. So if you go on my Spotify playlist or my Twitter feed, you can find the playlists for each of my novels. You can find Emma Morley's record collection, you can find the Sweet Sorrow playlist, you can find the music we used for the Us television series, because for me, they've always been intertwined. I think the emotional response we get from music is often very direct and mysterious, but I'm happy if I can find some of that in words on the page as well. If readers can have a similar response to a novel as they do to a favorite song.
That's fascinating. Now, what is your Twitter in case anyone wants to go check out those playlists?
I think it's at David N. Writer. And also,
Okay.
if you can't find them on the link, I think they're pinned, then do DM me. My DMs are open and I will gladly send you
Okay,
links.
thank you. Now, someone is asking if you could adapt any book for the screen, which would you choose?
Oh, that's a tricky one, you know, because the curse of this is that often the books, you want to adapt a book because it would make a great film and someone's done it. You know, I love Dickens. I've adapted one Dickens. I adapted Great Expectations, but my favorite Dickens novel is Bleak House. I'd love to have done Bleak House, but there is a very good BBC TV adaptation. Let me think. There's a wonderful novel by Patrick Hamilton called Hangover Square, which I think would make a great film, except it has a very, very, very difficult technical screenwriting trick in it, in that it's about a kind of Jekyll and Hyde character. When you read the book, you know when he's good George and when he's bad George, because like I said, the author tells you. When you're watching it on screen, there's no way of knowing, and that's really the essence of that story. It's a really wonderful Gothic thriller, and if you could crack that problem, it could make a great film. So yes, Hangover Square by Patrick Hamilton. I still love a lot of Dickens. What is the Oh, well, I've written the script. I don't know if it'll ever get made, but one of my favorite novels is Tender is the Night by Scott Fitzgerald, which I think is a wonderful, underrated novel, great love story, great difficult story. And I've written a screenplay, but it's so uncommercial a story. You know, it's about failure and alcoholism and madness and all kinds of very difficult subjects. So there's a mismatch between the budget required to make it and the mood and subject matter of that novel. But that's one that I'd love to see make it to the screen one day. Tender is the Night. It's an amazing book, beautiful book, I think.
I know you talking about screenwriting. I know earlier you were talking about writing the screenplays for some of your own books.
Yeah.
I'd read an article recently about when you did the screenplay for the series of Us, and that you had to cut some of the locations out. There were things that you had to cut and how difficult that was for you. If you want to talk a couple of minutes about that and if that impacted the story, if you felt it was difficult to maintain the story with having to make those cuts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty stoical about that. You know, the Us is a road movie that travels all around Europe, and I knew we wouldn't get to Munich and Madrid and Barcelona and Florence and all of these places, because every time you go to one of these cities, you have to recruit a whole new crew, so we had to cut quite a lot of the travel. But you can still, move the story beats into a different location. That's not the end of the world. The hardest thing, always, 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 is losing a first-person voice. Adapting a first-person novel is very difficult because often what a character says is not what they think. And there's no way of conveying what they think except through performance. So there's no room in a screenplay for metaphor. There's no room in a screenplay for saying one thing and thinking the other, or not quite saying what you mean. You have to rely on performance for that. And so Douglas's inner voice, when you write a first-person novel, particularly that novel, because it's a very distinctive voice, it's a bit like getting into character, and you're seeing the world through a very fixed point of view, and other people's point of view and experience doesn't really matter because you're in character. You are Douglas and you're telling his story. When you employ actors, and you stand the things up, and it suddenly becomes a 3D world. It suddenly becomes an objective world, not a subjective world. And you have to provide attitudes and experiences and background for everyone on screen. So suddenly you have to flesh out all the other characters, and that's really thrilling and exciting. But actors will come up to you and say, what's my relationship with my parents? And you don't know because you wrote it as Douglas, and Douglas doesn't know. So when you write the screenplay, suddenly you have to flesh out certain things, and that's exciting. The flip side of that is you lose all the jokes that Douglas thinks but can't say. And also a lot of comedy, you'll notice it's not a coincidence, a lot of great comic novels are written in a first-person voice, because there's often the ironic mismatch between what we say and what we think is all over Bridget Jones. It's what makes Bridget Jones funny. She's behaving in a certain way, but she wants to achieve something different. And that irony is really, really funny and really hard to put on screen unless you use voiceover. So resisting voiceover is the other great challenge.
Right. We have time for another question. So we're going to go back to Sweet Sorrow. And Alice is asked to talk about Charlie's discovery that he loves reading. That's a great one to end with, huh?
Yeah. Well, I should say, because this is a library event, most of my education comes from libraries. It comes from Eastleigh Public Library, where I spent most of my childhood just reading the shelves at random, pretty much. And it's something that's cropped up in a lot of my books, the role of education and the role of reading and imagination in making us who we are. That's part of who Emma Morley is. It's part of who Charlie becomes. He's not done well at school, but he's just dipping a toe into fiction. Kurt Vonnegut is his way in Slaughterhouse-Five. And when he starts getting involved in Shakespeare, he finds that the Shakespearean language, the Shakespearean way of looking at the world, starts to infect his way of relating to the world. There's a lot of stuff in the novel about language, of finding the words to express ourselves clearly. And Charlie's language changes the deeper he goes into Shakespeare. And so I wanted that to be part of the novel, first love rarely lasts, but the experience that Charlie has whilst in love for the first time and putting on this play, they become entangled and sort of stay with him for the rest of his life. So yes, literature, storytelling, language alter Charlie in ways that he's not expecting at the beginning of the novel.
Oh, that's great. Denise, are you there?
Yes, I am. This is just wonderful. I do have one more question here, and it's about the act of writing and the act of acting.
Yeah.
Do you find similarity, such as succumbing to the force outside yourself?
Yes. I mean, I think when I was an actor, I was rarely called upon to create a character. I was mute a lot of the time, but when I could see other actors doing it, they were doing a lot of what a novelist does. Who is my character? What's their favorite song? What do they have for breakfast? What's their relationship with their parents? When were they born? What do they wear? What music do they listen to? All of that stuff, building a character, is very similar to acting for me. And I think when an actor creates a character, they're working with vocabulary and a rhythm of speech and a way of moving. And I think of all that stuff when I'm writing a novel as well, when I'm creating a character. And writing in the first person, for me anyway, is a little bit like getting into character. So I think there are lots of overlaps. Thankfully, I was a really, really bad actor. I was really bad at all this stuff, but I hope I'm better at it as a writer. It's what I like. I like that whole business of what do I want? What do I need? What's my motivation? What's the difference between what I'm saying, what I'm doing, what I'm saying, what I really want to say? All of that stuff, which has for me a lot of connections with acting. I get to do on the page now rather than the stage. And that's much, much better for everyone concerned.
Well, your fans and people who will discover you. And we are delighted that you chose the career of writing. And thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
It's probably about 11 o'clock there, right?
Yeah, it's
At night.
way past my bedtime. It's Thursday night. This is madness. Thank you for inviting me. It's very nice to meet everyone and to talk. And like I said, if I hadn't answered anyone's questions, please do contact me on Twitter. I'm very happy to respond there. But thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for being with us tonight. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.